Level 1. The Berenstain Paradox. Over the next 2 hours, you're going to discover 50 things that millions of people remember one way, but reality insists happened another. Memories so vivid, so universally shared, that when you learn the truth, you'll question whether your mind can be trusted at all. Small details that don't seem to matter. Historical facts, famous quotes, even human anatomy. All misremembered by thousands of people in exactly the same way. We begin with childhood. You probably grew up reading books about a family of bears, a father, mother, and 2 cubs living in a treehouse, teaching lessons about honesty, kindness, and sharing. And if someone asked you right now, without looking it up, to spell their last name, you'd write Berenstein, the way you've spelled it in your mind for decades, the way it looked on every spine lined up on your bookshelf, the Germanic surname ending in Stein, like Einstein, Frankenstein, Goldstein. But you'd be wrong. The books, every single one ever printed since Stan and Jan Berenstain created the series in 1962. Spell it Berenstain, with an a detail so apparently concrete that the publisher HarperCollins has confirmed it repeatedly. Archives show it. Photographs of original editions prove it. And yet thousands upon thousands of people, entire generations, swear with absolute certainty they remember Berenstain, can picture it clearly, would bet money on it. The psychological explanation involves pattern recognition and expectation bias. Our brains, encountering the surname Berenstain as children, likely autocorrected it to the far more common Stein suffix, then reinforced that false memory through decades of recall without verification, creating what psychologists call a false memory that feels more real than reality. What makes this particularly unnerving is the specificity. People don't vaguely misremember the name. They remember the exact wrong spelling, the same wrong spelling, which suggests either mass confabulation following identical cognitive pathways or something stranger, that we're all remembering correctly, and it's reality that changed. And if an entire generation can misremember something as fundamental as the spelling of their childhood books, if that shared false memory can persist for decades, despite countless opportunities for correction, then the ground beneath consensus reality starts to feel less solid than you'd like to believe. Level 2. The Monocle That Never Was. Picture the Monopoly Man. Rich Uncle Pennybags. That jovial plutocrat in the top hat and tuxedo who's represented Parker Brothers' real estate empire game since 1936. The mustachioed embodiment of capitalism with his walking stick and smug grin. And now picture his face closely, focusing specifically on his eyes, because if you're like most people, you're seeing a monocle, that single round lens perched in his right eye socket, the optical accessory that practically defines old money caricatures. Except he's never worn one, not in a single edition of Monopoly, not on any official card, board, or box art across nearly 90 years of production. Hasbro, which owns the rights, has confirmed repeatedly that Rich Uncle Pennybags has never, at any point in the game's history, worn a monocle. And yet this false memory is so widespread that when researchers show people images of the Monopoly Man and ask them to describe what's wrong, the majority don't notice the missing monocle because their brains fill it in automatically. The confusion likely stems from the Planters Peanuts mascot, Mr. Peanut, who does wear a monocle along with a top hat and cane, creating a blended mental image where 2 symbols of anthropomorphized wealth merge into a single composite memory. Your brain borrowing details from one rich cartoon character to complete another because that's what rich cartoon tycoons are supposed to look like. Top hat, cane, monocle, the visual shorthand for Gilded Age excess. What's unsettling isn't just that you misremembered a game piece, but that the monocle feels so correct, so definitionally right for that character, that its absence seems like the error, as if reality forgot to include a detail that should obviously be there, that must have been there, that exists so clearly in collective memory it's somehow more real than the actual printed boards gathering dust in closets across the world. Level 3. The Father Reveal. There's a moment in The Empire Strikes Back, the second Star Wars film released in 1980, that fundamentally altered popular culture. A plot twist so shocking that theaters filled with gasps, a revelation that became the template for every major surprise in cinema that followed. Darth Vader, the embodiment of evil encased in black armor and mechanical breathing, reveals to Luke Skywalker that he is, in fact, Luke's father, the man Luke believed Vader had murdered. And if you ask anyone to quote that line, if you've heard it referenced in conversation, comedy sketches, or parodies thousands of times over 4 decades, you'll hear the same 6 words. Luke, I am your father. Direct address, the villain speaking the hero's name. The iconic moment crystallized into a single quotable phrase that everyone knows, everyone can recite, everyone has heard. Except Darth Vader never says Luke. The actual line, verified in every version of the film's script and in the scene itself when you watch it without the fog of memory, is, "No, I am your father." A response to Luke's accusation that Vader killed his father. The word "no" functioning as both a denial and the first beat of the revelation. The psychological mechanism here involves context collapse. The line became so culturally ubiquitous, so frequently quoted in isolation, that it needed Luke's name attached to make sense outside the scene. So our collective memory added the word Luke to create a self-contained quotable moment that works without surrounding dialogue. And then that altered version became the dominant memory, the one that spreads, the one that feels true. What makes this particularly significant is that it's not a minor detail or a background element. It's arguably the most famous line in modern cinema, a moment millions of people watched multiple times, discussed, analyzed, and yet the version that lives in cultural memory isn't the version that was filmed, as if there's a gap between what happens and what we collectively agree happened. And that gap somehow feels more authoritative than the actual historical record. Level 4. The Cornucopia. Question. Think back to elementary school, to those mornings when you got dressed in clothes your parents bought from practical, affordable brands. Hanes underwear, Fruit of the Loom t-shirts, the basics that filled drawers in households across America. And if you wore Fruit of the Loom, try to remember the logo, that cluster of illustrated fruit that gave the company its name. Grapes, apples, leaves arranged in a welcoming pile. Now, picture what's behind the fruit. If you're imagining a cornucopia, that horn-shaped wicker basket associated with Thanksgiving, abundance spilling from its curved opening, you're remembering something that, according to Fruit of the Loom, never existed on any version of their logo in the company's 170-plus year history. A claim they've made repeatedly, definitively, backed by trademark records and archival images that show only fruit, never a basket, never a horn of plenty. But the memory is staggeringly widespread. Thousands of people don't just vaguely recall a cornucopia. They describe it in specific detail. The weaving pattern, the brown wicker color, the way it cradled the fruit from behind. the association with harvest imagery that made the logo feel cohesive, complete. The psychological explanation points to schema theory. Our brains, seeing fruit arranged in a pile, automatically recall associated imagery from Thanksgiving tableaus, harvest festivals, and grocery store displays where cornucopias commonly appear alongside fruit, so we unconsciously add the basket to complete the expected visual pattern. Then mistake that brain-generated completion for an actual memory. What's compelling here is the residue, the sheer number of people who claim to remember drawing the logo in elementary school art class, specifically including the cornucopia, describing it to their own children, using it as a teaching moment about what a cornucopia is. Memories layered with such specific contextual detail that dismissing them as simple misremembering starts to feel inadequate. And if our brains can insert an entire object into a logo we saw hundreds of times, if we can construct false memories with such specificity and consistency that thousands of people generate the same fictional detail, then what else are we adding to reality without knowing it? What other details is consensus memory painting over the actual world? Level 5. The Missing Tail. Curious George. The mischievous little monkey created by H.A. Ray in 1941. The children's book character who's been teaching lessons about curiosity, consequences, and problem-solving for over 80 years through adventures in the big city with the man in the yellow hat. Does not have a tail. Has never had a tail in any book, television adaptation, or official illustration. A fact that contradicts what feels like obvious monkey anatomy, and what many people remember seeing in the drawings they paged through as children, or read to their own kids. When you close your eyes and picture Curious George swinging from something, climbing, hanging, there's a tail in that image, a curved appendage doing what monkey tails do, because that's what monkeys have. That's what makes them monkeys. And Curious George is explicitly, definitively identified as a monkey in the book's text and marketing. The confusion here has a factual basis that makes the false memory particularly understandable. Most monkey species do have tails, and in children's media, illustrated monkeys almost universally feature tails, because that's the visual shorthand that communicates monkey to young readers who can't yet distinguish between monkey species based on subtle anatomical details. But Curious George, as Ray drew him, more closely resembles a chimpanzee or bonobo, which are great apes, not monkeys, and great apes don't have tails. A biological distinction that the books never explicitly address because they were written for children who don't need a primatology lesson in the middle of a story about painting a room blue. What makes this Mandela effect different from some of the others is that it has a clear, verifiable explanation rooted in a common misconception about animal taxonomy. And yet that explanation doesn't diminish the strangeness of the memory. You can look at images of Curious George right now, see that he definitively lacks a tail, understand intellectually why that's correct, and still feel viscerally certain that you remember him having one, that the version in your mind included that detail, that removing the tail feels like something was erased rather than something that was never there to begin with, and that gap between what you know and what you remember creates a small, persistent discomfort about whether the world you're observing matches the world you observed. Level 6. Pikachu's Black Tip. If you came of age during the Pokemon phenomenon of the late 1990s, when trading cards flooded school playgrounds, when Game Boy cartridges defined childhood, then you know Pikachu, the electric mouse mascot more recognizable to children than some world leaders. The yellow creature with red cheeks and a lightning bolt tail. Now, picture that tail in detail. The color, the shape, the distinctive zigzag pattern that makes it look like a bolt of electricity frozen mid-strike. And if you're picturing a black tip at the end of the tail, you're experiencing one of the more widespread Mandela effects among millennials and Gen Z, because Pikachu's tail has never, in any official artwork, game sprite, or animation frame across 25 years of franchise history, featured a black tip. It's entirely yellow, except for the brown base where it connects to the body. The confusion has a clear visual source. Pikachu's ears have black tips, creating a color pattern that many people's brains apparently extended to the tail to maintain symmetry. A form of visual expectation where we unconsciously complete patterns we think should be there based on partial information. The same cognitive shortcut that lets us read sentences missing letters or recognize faces from minimal details. What's compelling is how specific the false memory is. People don't vaguely recall some dark coloring on the tail. They remember a black tip, positioned at the very end, mirroring the ear pattern. A detail so precise that it suggests not random memory corruption, but systematic pattern completion. Our brains generating the same false detail independently, because it makes visual sense, because it satisfies our expectation of symmetry. And when you look at actual images of Pikachu now, when you see the tail is just yellow and brown, there's a moment where it looks incomplete, like something's missing, like the designers forgot to finish coloring it in, which reveals how powerfully our expectations shape what we think we're seeing. We're not just observing reality, we're constantly predicting it, filling in gaps, completing patterns. And sometimes the version our brain generates feels more correct than the version that actually exists. Level 7. The Golden Leg. C-3-P-O, the protocol droid from Star Wars, the neurotic golden robot programmed for etiquette and translation. Close your eyes and picture him. Not his personality, but his physical appearance. The metallic plating that covers his humanoid frame, and you're almost certainly seeing a completely gold droid. Every panel, every limb, every surface reflecting that warm brass color that defines his visual identity, except his right leg, from just below the knee down to the ankle, has been silver in every single appearance, dating back to the original 1977 film. A detail visible in countless scenes, if you're specifically looking for it, but apparently invisible to the millions of people who watched these movies multiple times. Owned action figures, dressed as C-3PO for Halloween, and never consciously registered that one leg didn't match. The psychological explanation involves selective attention and visual prominence. C-3PO's gold plating is so definitional, so central to his character design, that it becomes the only color information our brains bother encoding about him, and the silver leg, being a relatively small detail on a typically fast-moving character in visually busy scenes, never crosses the threshold of conscious attention. So our memory system, reconstructing the image later, fills in the missing leg with the dominant color because that's more efficient than storing every individual detail. What makes this Mandela effect different from some of the others is that the evidence is indisputable and immediately verifiable. You can watch A New Hope right now, see the silver leg clearly in multiple shots, confirm that it's been there all along, and yet the false memory persists even after correction. Your brain still wanting to remember an all-gold droid despite knowing intellectually that the leg is silver. There's something unsettling about discovering you overlooked the same detail in the same scenes for decades, that your attention could be so selective that a different colored limb on a main character simply didn't register, which raises questions about what else you're not seeing. What other details are sliding past your conscious awareness, while your brain fills in the gaps with assumptions expectations, and the version of reality it thinks should be there instead of the version that is. Level 8. Mirror, Mirror. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney's first animated feature released in 1937, gave popular culture one of its most enduring villains, the evil queen, consulting her magic mirror to confirm she remains the fairest of them all. When people quote that scene, they say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" Those exact words, a phrase so embedded in cultural consciousness it appears in everything from sketch comedy to everyday conversation whenever someone wants to reference vanity. But the queen never says, "Mirror, mirror." The actual line is, "Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" Not mirror, mirror, but magic mirror. Not fairest of them all, but fairest one of all. Two significant differences that change the rhythm and emphasis entirely. The confusion likely stems from cultural transmission and the telephone game effect of quotation. The phrase "mirror, mirror" has better cadence, better rhythm, feels more like an incantation or spell with its repetition. So, when people retold the story, when parodies referenced it, when writers needed a quick shorthand for the scene, they used the more poetic version, and that version spread faster and further than the actual line because it was more memorable, more quotable, more satisfying to say. What's particularly interesting is that this isn't a case of misremembering something you experienced directly. Most people haven't watched the 1937 Snow White recently, if ever. It's collective memory shaped by secondary sources, by references and parodies and cultural osmosis, where the misquote became more famous than the original, more true in cultural terms than the actual words Walt Disney's animators put on screen. And that suggests something about how memory works at the cultural level, how truth gets voted on rather than observed, how the version that spreads isn't necessarily the version that happened, and how millions of people can be confidently wrong about something they'd swear they remember hearing, even though what they remember is an echo of an echo of an echo. Each repetition moving further from the source until the copy becomes the canonical version and reality becomes the outlier. Level 9. Box of Chocolates. Forrest Gump, released in 1994, gave us Tom Hanks on a bench in Savannah, telling his life story while eating chocolates, sharing his mother's wisdom about life's unpredictability, comparing existence to a box of chocolates where you never know what you're going to get. If you quote that line right now, you'll say, "Life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're gonna get." Present tense, treating life as an ongoing metaphor. But Forrest says, life was like a box of chocolates. Past tense, speaking about his mother's past philosophy rather than making a present tense observation. The psychological explanation involves how our brains process and store quotes. Present tense statements feel more universal, more quotable, more like wisdom rather than personal anecdote. So, when we recall memorable lines, we unconsciously shift them into present tense to maximize their applicability, to turn them from one character's observation into timeless truth. The original past tense keeps it grounded in Forrest's specific memory of his mother, makes it her line rather than his, but the cultural memory version erases that attribution, makes it Forrest's own philosophy stated as current fact, which is actually more powerful rhetorically, even if it's less accurate to what was filmed. What's unsettling here isn't just the verb tense. It's how that small change reveals the way memory optimizes for meaning rather than accuracy. How our brains prioritize what makes sense, what feels true, what's most useful over what actually happened. As if truth is less important than narrative coherence. You can watch the scene right now, hear Tom Hanks clearly say was, confirm the past tense, and your brain will still want to remember is because that version works better as a quote, serves the function of wisdom better than a reminiscence about someone else's philosophy. Reality, it turns out, is less memorable than the version we collectively agree reality should have been, and sometimes the edited version, the culturally optimized version, the version that never quite happened the way we remember it, becomes more real than the original. Level 10. Toons or Toons. Looney Tunes, the Warner Brothers animated series that ran from 1930 to 1969, featuring Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, and dozens of other characters in short cartoons that defined American animation. Has a name that millions of people spell wrong in their heads every time they think about it, because the logical spelling, the one that makes sense given that these are cartoon characters engaged in cartoonish antics, would be Toons, as in cartoons, as in the medium itself, but it's Tunes, as in music, as in melodies, which references the series' origins as musical shorts designed to promote Warner Brothers' music catalog. Though that historical context has been completely forgotten by most viewers who just know these as cartoons, not as musical showcases, making the actual spelling feel arbitrary and wrong. The psychological mechanism here involves phonetic expectation meeting semantic logic. We hear Looney Tunes pronounced, we associate it with animated characters, and our brains autocorrect the spelling to match the content. Cartoons are Toons, so obviously it must be spelled that way, and that mental correction happens so automatically, so below the threshold of conscious thought, that we construct a false memory of seeing Looney Tunes on screen, in TV guides, on VHS tapes, never questioning it until someone points out the actual spelling. What complicates this particular Mandela effect is the companion series Merry Melodies, which ran alongside Looney Tunes and reinforced the musical connection through its title. But even that doesn't help most people remember the correct spelling, because melodies makes sense, while tunes for cartoons doesn't, creating cognitive dissonance every time you're forced to confront the real spelling. And the residue here is minimal. There's no merchandise spelling it Looney Tunes, no archival material supporting the false memory. Just millions of people independently making the same logical assumption about how a cartoon show should spell its name, which demonstrates how powerfully expectations shape memory. When reality doesn't match what makes sense, we remember what makes sense and assume reality is the error, as if the world should conform to our logic rather than the other way around. Level 11. The Kit Kat Hyphen. Kit Kat, the chocolate-covered wafer bar introduced in 1935, became one of the world's most recognizable candy brands, a product so ubiquitous that most people have unwrapped hundreds over their lifetime. Now, picture that logo. The letters, the styling, and specifically whether there's a hyphen between Kit and Kat. And if you're seeing Kit Kat with a hyphen, you're experiencing the same false memory as millions of others, because the official logo has never included a hyphen in any market, any era, any packaging variation since the product's creation. The confusion likely stems from how we mentally process compound brand names, our brains encountering two short words that form a single product name. Expect hyphenation because that's standard English convention for compound words, especially playful ones like Kit Kat, where the repetition of the K sound suggests intentional wordplay that formal punctuation would typically acknowledge. What's particularly interesting is how confidently people remember the hyphen. This isn't vague uncertainty. It's specific visual recall of seeing Kit Kat printed on wrappers, written in advertisements, displayed on candy aisle shelves. A false memory so detailed that when confronted with actual Kit Kat packaging, many people's first reaction is that the hyphen was recently removed as part of a logo redesign, rather than that they've been misremembering it for decades. The psychological mechanism involves schema-based memory. We store the concept hyphenated candy name rather than the actual visual details, then reconstruct that memory later using rules we think apply. And our linguistic intuition about how compound words should be written overrides our actual visual memory of what we saw. And there's something revealing in that override, in the way our expectations about how language works trump our memory of specific instances, as if our brains trust grammar more than observation, prefer logical consistency over historical accuracy, would rather remember a world that follows predictable rules than the messier reality where brand names ignore conventions and hyphens appear or disappear based on corporate whim rather than grammatical logic. Level 12. In the City. Sex and the City, the HBO series that ran from 1998 to 2004, became a cultural phenomenon that influenced fashion and turned Sarah Jessica Parker into an icon. And if you're like most people, you've been mentally spelling the title with the wrong preposition for over 2 decades, because it feels more natural to say Sex in the City, placing the sex inside the urban environment. But it's Sex in the City, the conjunction and rather than the preposition in, treating Sex in the City as parallel subjects being examined together. The psychological explanation involves linguistic intuition and common speech patterns. We say in the city constantly in everyday conversation, the preposition in being the standard way to describe location within urban spaces. So, when we hear Sex in the City spoken aloud, our brains auto-correct it to the more familiar construction, the one that appears in thousands of other contexts, and that correction happens below conscious awareness, encoding the false version into memory as if it's what we actually heard. What makes this particular Mandela effect interesting is that it's purely linguistic. There's no visual component, no logo ambiguity, just a title that sounds like it should use one word but actually uses another. And yet the false memory persists even among people who watched every episode, owned the DVDs, participated in fan communities, never questioning their mental spelling until someone explicitly points out the error. The residue here is minimal. You won't find official merchandise spelling it in instead of and, won't find episode guides or credits that support the false memory. Just widespread misremembering driven by the fact that Sex in the City follows more natural speech patterns than Sex in the City, obeys the grammar we expect from a title describing activities in a location. And when you're corrected, when you learn it's and, not in, there's a moment where the actual title sounds wrong, stilted, grammatically awkward, as if the show itself is misnamed, and everyone just went along with it instead of pointing out that the preposition should obviously be in, which reveals how deeply we trust our linguistic intuition over external evidence. How readily we'll decide that reality must be mistaken when it violates the rules we know language should follow. Pause here for a moment. 12 Mandela effects. 12 things millions of people remember wrong. Notice what you're feeling. Confusion, curiosity, maybe recognition that your memory isn't as reliable as you thought. If any of these have already shifted how you see things, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The famous ones are behind you. What's ahead goes deeper. Obscure cases that make you wonder how so many could share such specific false memories. Stay with me. Level 13, the Genie movie that wasn't. In the mid-1990s, during the height of family-friendly comedy films, thousands of children watched a film called Shazam, a comedy about a genie played by Sinbad, the comedian known for Jingle All the Way and his HBO specials. Except that movie doesn't exist. Sinbad has never played a genie, never starred in a film called Shazam, has explicitly and repeatedly confirmed on social media that he didn't make it. And yet the false memory is so widespread that people describe the plot, remember scenes, recall the VHS box art featuring Sinbad in genie attire with his arms crossed, can tell you approximately when they watched it. What actually exists is Kazam, a 1996 film starring Shaquille O'Neal as a genie, and the confusion between Sinbad and Shaq, two black entertainers from the same era, both tall, both known for family comedies, provides partial explanation, though it doesn't fully account for the specificity or why people remember Shazam rather than Kazam. The phenomenon deepened when internet communities discovered this shared false memory, with thousands contributing identical details. Early to mid-90s release. Sinbad wore a purple or teal genie vest. The plot involved two kids finding the lamp. It aired frequently on weekend television. Details that align too precisely to be random confabulation. What makes this one of the more unsettling Mandela effects is that it's not just a small detail. It's an entire feature film, complete with plot, star, title, and distribution, existing so clearly in collective memory that proving it never existed feels like gaslighting, like being told you imagined 2 hours of your childhood that you specifically remember experiencing, and the inability to find any evidence creates cognitive dissonance where you're forced to choose between trusting your memory and trusting verifiable reality. What makes this one of the more unsettling Mandela effects is that it's not just a small detail or a spelling. It's an entire feature film, complete with plot, star, title, and distribution, existing so clearly in collective memory that proving it never existed feels like gaslighting, like being told you imagined 2 hours of your childhood that you specifically remember experiencing, and the inability to find any evidence of something you're certain you watched creates a unique kind of cognitive dissonance where you're forced to choose between trusting your memory and trusting verifiable reality. Level 14. Froot Loops. Logic. Froot Loops, the colorful ring-shaped breakfast cereal introduced by Kellogg's in 1963, has been a childhood staple for generations. And if you've ever written the product name down, you probably assumed it was spelled F-R-U-I-T loops, because the cereal is fruit-flavored and there's no logical reason to misspell a common word. But it's F-R-O-O-T, a deliberate phonetic spelling that's been consistent since 1963, and yet millions of people have no conscious memory of this unusual spelling, their brains auto-correcting it to standard English every time they see it. The psychological explanation involves automatic spelling correction. Our brains, highly trained in standard orthography through years of education, instinctively normalize misspellings when processing text, particularly in commercial contexts where playful spelling is common but not usually memorable. So we see fruit, but encode fruit, because that's the proper spelling, the one that makes sense, the one our literate brains expect. What's interesting is that this isn't conscious misremembering. People aren't making an active choice to spell it wrong. They genuinely don't notice or don't remember the non-standard spelling, even after eating the cereal hundreds of times. Even after staring at the box while eating breakfast, their attention focused on other elements while the spelling detail slides past conscious registration. The brand's deliberate misspelling serves a legal purpose. You can't trademark common words, so Froot Loops is protectable intellectual property, while Froot Loops would be generic. But that commercial logic means nothing to consumers whose brains are just trying to quickly identify the colorful O-shaped cereal without wasting cognitive resources on whether marketing departments spelled fruit correctly. And this reveals something about attention and memory. We don't actually observe most of what we look at. We recognize patterns and fill in expected details, so you can stare directly at words thousands of times over a lifetime without ever consciously processing how they're spelled if the spelling isn't relevant to the task of identifying what the words represent. And the version you remember is the version that should be there, the grammatically correct version, not the actual marketing-driven misspelling that's been sitting in front of you all along. Level 15. Oscar's Dilemma. Oscar Mayer, the American meat company founded in 1883, became synonymous with hot dogs through the Oscar Mayer Wiener jingle. Oh, I wish I were an Oscar Mayer Wiener. A song so embedded in cultural memory that the brand name became inseparable from the melody. And if you've sung that jingle, you probably wrote M-E-Y-E-R, the far more common spelling of that German surname, following standard patterns. But the company spells it M-A-Y-E-R, with an a detail printed on every package for over a century. And yet the false memory of Meyer persists, because our brains, hearing my-er, auto-correct the spelling to match the most frequent pattern for that pronunciation. The psychological mechanism involves statistical learning. We've encountered the surname Meyer hundreds of times in other contexts, classmates, co-workers, public figures, and that common spelling becomes the default our brains reach for when encoding Oscar Mayer into memory, overriding the less frequent Mayer variant, even though that's what's actually printed on the packaging. What complicates this particular Mandela effect is the jingle, which reinforced the pronunciation so strongly that it became more memorable than the spelling. And when you try to visualize the brand name written out, your brain reconstructs it using the spelling rules you've learned from all the other Meyers you've encountered, creating a false memory that feels absolutely certain because it's based on real linguistic patterns, just applied to the wrong specific instance. The residue here is the disconnect between how something sounds and how it's spelled. Mayer and Meyer are pronounced identically, so there's no auditory cue to correct the false memory. Nothing that jars you into realizing your spelling is wrong when you hear the name spoken, which means the error can persist indefinitely, unless you specifically look at the written name and consciously register the spelling. And that highlights how much of memory is reconstruction rather than playback. We don't store exact visual records of everything we see. We store concepts and then rebuild them using rules and patterns when we need them. And sometimes the rules we apply, the common way to spell that name, override the specific instance we actually encountered, leaving us confidently wrong about something we've seen hundreds of times but never truly looked at. Level 16. The fresh smell. Febreze, the odor-eliminating fabric spray introduced by Procter & Gamble in 1998, became a household staple through marketing that positioned it as the solution to everything from pet odors to cigarette smoke. And if you've ever bought a bottle, you probably read the name as F-E-B-R-E-E-Z-E, with two E's in the middle, because breeze is a common English word, and a product that eliminates odors would logically be named after the pleasant air that carries away bad smells. But it's F-E-B-R-E-Z-E, with only one E, a spelling that violates the phonetic expectation our brains have when encountering a word that sounds like breeze. The psychological mechanism involves phonetic spelling expectations. we hear Febreze pronounced. Our brains access the spelling rules for words ending in that sound, and breeze is such a common word that the double E pattern feels mandatory, overriding our visual memory of the actual single E spelling on the bottle. What makes this Mandela effect particularly persistent is that the misspelling actually makes more linguistic sense than the correct spelling. Febreze follows standard English patterns for representing the long E sound, while Febreze looks like it should be pronounced differently, maybe Febreze, making the actual spelling feel like a mistake that the company made and everyone just accepted, rather than the intentional branding choice it was. The company likely chose the single E spelling for trademark purposes. Febreze would be too close to the common word breeze to be easily protectable, while Febreze creates enough distinction to function as intellectual property. But that legal reasoning means nothing to consumers whose brains just want spellings to make phonetic sense. And this reveals how little conscious attention we pay to spellings that don't interfere with recognition. You can use a product dozens of times, read its name on the bottle while holding it in your hand, and still encode the wrong spelling into memory because your brain is focused on grab the odor spray, not verify the orthographic accuracy of the brand name. And the version you remember is the version that follows spelling rules, not the version that was actually printed, because memory optimizes for logic over accuracy. Level 17. The color confusion. Chartreuse, the word for a specific color that appears in everything from fashion to interior design, refers to a bright yellowish green, the color of new spring leaves or lime sherbet, named after the French liqueur chartreuse, which has that distinctive greenish-yellow hue. And yet thousands of people, including those who work in visual fields, believe with absolute certainty that chartreuse is a purplish-red or magenta color, a complete reversal of where the color sits on the spectrum. This isn't slight confusion between similar shades. People remember chartreuse as being on the opposite end of the visible spectrum, mistaking a yellow-green for a red-purple. The psychological explanation involves incomplete memory and association errors. Many people learn color names without visual reference, hearing chartreuse used without actually seeing the color being described, and their brain assigns the unfamiliar word to a remembered color based on the word's sound. Chartreuse sounds fancy, French, sophisticated, the kind of word that might describe an unusual purplish shade. What's particularly interesting is how confidently wrong people are about this. It's not hesitant uncertainty, but firm conviction, sometimes including memories of seeing chartreuse-colored items that were actually that purplish-red shade they're thinking of, which suggests that once the incorrect color association formed, it became self-reinforcing, with every subsequent encounter with the word chartreuse being mentally linked to the wrong color because that's what the brain had on file. The actual color chartreuse is fairly uncommon in nature and fashion, so opportunities for correction are limited. And if someone says, "I love that chartreuse scarf," while pointing at a yellowish-green item, the person who thinks chartreuse is purple might just assume that particular scarf is the wrong color, or that the speaker is confused, rather than updating their own mental definition. And this demonstrates how powerfully words and concepts can detach from their actual reference in memory. You can confidently use a color name for years, incorporating it into your vocabulary without ever verifying what color it actually describes, and the version in your head, based on sound, association, and incomplete context, feels just as real as if you'd looked it up in a color chart and memorized the correct shade. Level 18. Penney's problem. J.C. Penney, the American department store chain founded in 1902 by James Cash Penney, became a fixture of suburban malls and small-town main streets throughout the 20th century. A brand so embedded in American commercial life that most people have walked past the storefront logo hundreds of times without consciously processing its spelling. And if you were asked to write the company name right now, you'd probably put a space between J.C. and Penney, treating the founder's initials as separate from his surname the way most abbreviated names are formatted. But the official spelling is J.C. Penney. No space, no periods, all run together as a single unit. A branding choice that's been consistent for decades but apparently invisible to millions of shoppers. The psychological mechanism involves default formatting expectations for abbreviated names. We're trained from childhood that initials get periods and spaces. J.K. Rowling, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. So, when we encounter J.C. Penney, our brains autocorrect it to match the standard pattern, inserting the space and sometimes the periods that we expect to see in abbreviated names, then storing that corrected version rather than the actual formatting. What makes this Mandela effect particularly interesting is that it's pure typography, nothing to do with pronunciation or meaning. J.C. Penney and J.C. Penney are functionally identical when spoken aloud, refer to the same stores, convey the same information, and yet the spacing difference reveals how much our brains rely on standardized patterns when encoding visual information. How a detail as minor as whether there's a space character between two groups of letters can be systematically misremembered because the brain prioritizes, this is how names should be formatted, over, this is how this specific name is actually formatted. The company's decision to remove the space was likely a branding move to create a more cohesive visual unit. But that aesthetic choice contradicts decades of learned patterns about how American names work. And when learned patterns conflict with specific instances, memory sides with the patterns, reconstructing the specific instance to match what should be there rather than what is there, leaving you absolutely certain you've seen J.C. Penney with a space even though that version has never appeared on official materials. Level 19. The Chick Question. Chick-fil-A, the fast food chicken restaurant chain founded in 1946, known for its chicken sandwiches and policy of closing on Sundays, has a name that millions have mispronounced or misspelled because the stylization doesn't match standard capitalization patterns. And if you've never looked closely at how the name is written, you might assume it's Chick-fil-A with a capital F, or possibly Chick-fil-A without the K, treating chick as the French word for stylish rather than chick, as in baby chicken. But the actual name is Chick-fil-A with a lowercase f, using chick spelled with a K to make the chicken connection obvious and fill as a stylized abbreviation of filet, all presented in a specific capitalization pattern that prioritizes brand distinctiveness over linguistic consistency. The confusion stems from competing expectations about how brand names should work. Capital letters typically mark word boundaries in compound names, so camel case formatting would suggest Chick-fil-A, treating each component as worthy of capitalization, while the actual lowercase fill violates that expectation and makes the brand harder to visually parse, creating cognitive friction that many people's brains resolve by remembering it the correct way with standard capitalization instead of the actual trademarked way with non-standard capitalization. What's particularly interesting is how the spelling variations cluster around different mental models. Some people remember chic-fil-a because they parse it as French-adjacent fancy chicken. Some remember Chick-fil-A because they apply standard compound name rules, and some remember Chick-fil-A because they complete the word fillet to its full spelling. Each error representing a different way the brain tried to make sense of an intentionally irregular brand name. The company chose this specific styling to be memorable, distinctive, and trademarkable. But that distinctiveness comes at the cost of being easily misremembered, because brains prefer regular patterns they can encode efficiently over irregular patterns that require storing specific visual details. And when you're just trying to remember the chicken sandwich place rather than memorizing corporate branding decisions, your brain stores whichever spelling makes the most intuitive sense, not the legally protected version that violates standard orthographic conventions. Level 20. Double or nothing. Oreos, the chocolate sandwich cookies that Nabisco introduced in 1912, became America's best-selling cookie through variations including double stuff. Extra cream filling between the chocolate wafers, marketed with packaging that emphasized the increased filling quantity. And if you've bought double stuff Oreos, you almost certainly remember it as double stuff with 2 F's, because stuff is a common English word meaning things or material, and double stuff would logically mean twice as much of the cream filling. But Nabisco spells it stuff with a single F, S-T-U-F, an intentionally shortened version that's been consistent since 1974. And yet this unconventional spelling is largely invisible to consumers who mentally auto-correct it to double stuff. The psychological mechanism is simple phonetic correction. Stuff and stuff are pronounced identically, so the missing F creates no auditory cue that would alert you to the spelling difference. And in the absence of that cue, your brain defaults to standard English orthography when encoding the memory, storing stuff because that's the real word rather than stuff, which looks like a typo or abbreviation. The company's decision to use the non-standard spelling likely serves multiple purposes. It makes the brand name more distinctive and trademarkable. It fits better on packaging with one fewer letter. It creates a playful informality that matches the product's fun image. But those marketing considerations are completely invisible to consumers whose brains are just trying to recognize the Oreos with extra filling, without wasting cognitive resources on verifying whether single-syllable words are spelled according to dictionary standards. And this reveals the gap between how brands see their names as carefully crafted intellectual property with specific legal spelling requirements, and how consumers see them as functional labels whose spelling matters far less than the product they identify, where double stuff and double stuff are the same thing, and the brain will helpfully correct one to the other without bothering to ask which version is officially printed on the package you're holding. Level 21. The singular snack. Cheez-It, the square cheese crackers manufactured by Kellogg's since 1921, became a staple snack food through their sharp cheddar flavor and satisfying crunch. The kind of thing you buy in family-size boxes for lunches, road trips, or mindless eating while watching television. And if you've reached into the box hundreds of times, if you've read the brand name while pouring crackers into a bowl, you almost certainly remember it as Cheez-Its with an S, the plural form that makes logical sense when you're describing multiple crackers, which is how the product is always consumed and discussed in plural contexts like, "Pass me the Cheez-Its," or "I finished the whole box of Cheez-Its." But the brand name is Cheez-It, singular, no S, a grammatical choice that's been consistent for over a century, despite the product always being sold and eaten in multiples, creating a permanent mismatch between how the brand is named and how it's actually used in language. The psychological explanation involves functional grammar. We talk about products in ways that match how we interact with them. So, a snack that comes in quantities gets discussed in plural form, even if the brand name is technically singular, and our memory encodes the grammatically logical version, Cheez-Its, rather than the technically correct but functionally awkward singular form. What makes this particularly interesting is that the false memory aligns with how the product's direct competitors are named. Wheat Thins, Triscuits, Ritz Crackers, all plural or plural sounding. So, Cheez-Its fits the expected pattern for cracker brands while Cheez-It violates it. And when patterns conflict with specific instances, memory defaults to the pattern. The company's decision to use the singular form was likely driven by branding distinctiveness. Cheez-It is more unusual, more memorable, more trademarkable than Cheez-Its would be. But that marketing logic contradicts basic grammar about how we describe quantities of food, and most consumers, reaching for a handful of crackers, aren't thinking about corporate branding strategies. They're thinking, I want some Cheez-Its, using the plural that makes sense even though it's wrong, and that spoken plural becomes the remembered spelling, because memory prioritizes functional communication over brand accuracy. Level 22. The undergarment shift. Depends. The adult incontinence product introduced by Kimberly-Clark in 1978 became a category-defining brand through advertising that destigmatized age-related bladder control issues and positioned the product as a solution for maintaining active lifestyles. And if you've seen commercials, walked past the product in pharmacy aisles, or discussed it in the context of elderly care, you might assume the brand name is Depend, singular, following the pattern where product names function as mass nouns or verbs rather than plurals, as in, I need Depend the way you'd say, I need Kleenex, or I need Advil. But the actual brand name is Depends with an S, treating the product name as a plural or possessive form, a grammatical choice that feels slightly awkward when used in sentences, but has been the official name since the product's launch. The confusion stems from how brand names typically work in the personal care category. Most are singular forms that function as mass nouns: Tide, Crest, Dove, Secret. So, encountering a plural form in this context violates expectations and gets mentally auto-corrected to the standard pattern. The psychological mechanism involves categorical expectations. When our brain files adult incontinence brand into memory alongside other personal care products, it applies the naming rules from that category, storing Depend, because that's how products in this space are typically named, not Depends, which follows different grammatical logic. What's particularly revealing about this Mandela effect is how the brand name itself has become euphemistic. People often avoid saying it directly, referring to those products, or adult diapers instead, which means opportunities to verify the actual spelling are limited, and the false memory can persist, because you're not regularly seeing or saying the word. You're mentally accessing a concept that might be filed under the wrong name, and the company's choice of a plural form was possibly an attempt at euphemism itself. Depends sounds less clinical than depend, implies reliance or dependability rather than medical necessity. But that subtle branding nuance is lost on consumers whose brains just want the product names to follow predictable patterns, and Depend fits the pattern better than Depends does, regardless of what's actually printed on the package. Level 23. The shoe spelling. Skechers, the footwear brand founded in 1992 that grew into a major athletic and casual shoe manufacturer, became widely recognized through celebrity endorsements and distinctive styling. And if you've shopped for shoes, seen the brand in mall stores, or bought a pair, there's a significant chance you mentally spelled it Skechers with a T, because the word sounds like it's related to sketch, as in drawing or designing, which would make logical sense for a shoe brand emphasizing style and appearance. And Skechers looks right, feels right, follows standard English spelling patterns for how that sound is typically represented. But it's Skechers with a K, no T, a deliberately non-standard spelling that's been consistent since the company's founding, but apparently invisible to the millions of customers who see the name on shoeboxes, shopping bags, and storefront signs without the spelling irregularity registering consciously. The psychological explanation involves phonetic expectations and visual similarity. Skechers and Skechers are pronounced identically in most dialects, creating no auditory cue to correct the false memory, and the spelling with a T represents the standard way English handles that phonetic sequence. We write sketch, sketchy, sketching with a T. So our brains assume Skechers follows the same pattern, while the actual spelling with just a K looks like a typo or non-standard variant that we autocorrect without thinking. What's interesting is that the misspelling creates a different etymological implication. Skechers suggests artists or designers, people who sketch, giving the brand a creative connotation, while Skechers doesn't connect to any obvious English word, making it more of an invented brand name without clear meaning, which is probably why our brains prefer the Skechers spelling. It tells a story, creates an association, makes sense in a way the actual spelling doesn't. The company chose the unusual spelling for trademark purposes and brand distinctiveness, but that choice means fighting against established English orthographic patterns that tell people how words with that sound should be spelled. And when standard spelling patterns conflict with brand-specific irregularities, memory sides with the patterns, storing Skechers, because that's how English works, not Skechers, which looks like someone misspelled Skechers and decided to keep the mistake. Level 24. The VW Gap. Volkswagen, the German automobile manufacturer founded in 1937, uses a logo that consists of a V sitting above a W inside a circle, a design that's appeared on millions of vehicles worldwide. And if you picture that logo right now, think specifically about whether there's a line connecting the V and the W, or whether they're separate letters with a gap between them, because this detail has become one of the more contentious Mandela effects, with people firmly remembering both versions. Some insist there's a horizontal line connecting the bottom of the V to the top of the W, creating a unified symbol, while others are equally certain there's a gap, with the V floating above the W without connection. The reality is that the logo has evolved. Older versions from the 1960s to 1970s had a more connected appearance with the letters closer together, while the modern redesigned logo introduced in 2000 and updated in 2019 has a cleaner separation with the letters more distinct. But neither version matches perfectly what many people remember. And the gap/no gap debate represents people remembering different eras of the logo design or amalgamating features from multiple versions into a single remembered image. The psychological mechanism involves logo evolution blindness. Corporate symbols change gradually over time through subtle redesigns that individual consumers don't track consciously. So, your brain might be storing a composite memory that blends features from the 1970s logo you saw as a child, the 1990s logo on your first car, and the 2000s redesign you see currently, creating a remembered version that doesn't match any specific historical iteration but feels more right than the actual current design. What makes this Mandela effect different from most others is that both false memories have some basis in reality. The logo has existed in connected and separated forms at different times. So the debate isn't about remembering something that never existed. It's about which version people's brains decided was the main logo, and stored as the canonical form while forgetting or de-emphasizing the variations, which reveals how memory handles gradual change by creating a single representative version, rather than storing every iteration we've encountered. Level 25. The Unsung Ending. We Are the Champions. Queen's anthemic victory song, released in 1977, became one of the most recognizable rock songs in history, played at sporting events and celebrations worldwide. And if you've sung it, you remember it ending with Freddie Mercury belting, "We are the champions of the world," holding that final note as the song concludes. But the studio version doesn't end that way. The final chorus cuts off after "We are the champions," with no "of the world" at the end, the song fading out on the title phrase alone, leaving the expected completion hanging. The confusion has multiple sources. Earlier in the song, Mercury does sing "of the world" after the chorus, so the phrase exists in the track and gets associated with the chorus generally. And the live versions Queen performed almost always included "of the world" at the end, because it's the natural, crowd-pleasing way to finish the song. So anyone who saw Queen perform it, or heard live recordings, would have the complete ending in memory. And many radio edits or sports stadium versions use live recordings or extended cuts that do include the phrase. The psychological explanation involves expectation completion. The song builds to a climactic ending. The phrase, "We are the champions," creates a grammatical and musical expectation of completion. And "of the world" is the obvious, satisfying, necessary conclusion that the melody and rhythm demand. So our brains, hearing the song trail off, fill in what must come next based on musical logic and the pattern established earlier in the song. What's unsettling is how certain the false memory feels. You can listen to the studio version right now. Hear it definitively end without "of the world." Confirm that the phrase isn't there, and your brain will still insist that's not how the song is supposed to end, that something's missing, that this version is incomplete or edited, as if the recorded version is the error, and the version in your memory is the correct one, which reveals how powerfully expectation shapes perception. When reality doesn't deliver the resolution we're anticipating, we remember the resolution anyway, and trust that memory more than we trust the recording. You're halfway through now. 25 Mandela effects. From childhood book spellings to movie quotes to corporate logos that millions of people remember differently than they actually exist. And maybe you've noticed something. It's not getting easier to dismiss these as simple mistakes. Each one feels right in the wrong version, feels wrong in the correct version, creates that small, uncomfortable gap between what you're certain you remember and what reality insists is true. And here's what makes it unsettling. These aren't random errors scattered across different people's memories. They're the same errors. Thousands, sometimes millions of people, independently remembering Berenstain, not Berenstain. Remembering a monocle that was never there. Remembering movie lines that were never spoken. All making identical mistakes about things they saw with their own eyes, heard with their own ears, encountered hundreds of times over decades. That's not how random memory failure should work. Random errors should be random. Different people making different mistakes in different directions. But these errors have patterns. They cluster. They align. This is where things shift. What you've heard so far, the famous effects, the brand names, the quotes, those are almost comforting in their wrongness. the kind of thing you can laugh about, share with friends, chalk up to the brain's quirks without feeling too unsettled. But the effects ahead go deeper into territory that's harder to explain with simple psychology or memory formation errors. You're about to hear cases where the false memories are so specific, so widespread, so resistant to conventional explanation that they stop feeling like mistakes and start feeling like something else. Like glimpses of a reality that doesn't quite match the one we're living in now. If you're still listening, if you've made it this far, you're not a casual observer anymore. You're someone who can sit with uncertainty, who can hold the tension between what you remember and what is, who's willing to question whether the world you've been observing is the world that exists. Subscribe if you haven't already. This is where it starts getting really interesting. Because the next 25 aren't just about spelling or phrasing or logo details. They're about geography that seems to have shifted, human anatomy that appears to have changed, historical events that happened differently than thousands of people remember. The ground beneath consensus reality is about to feel less solid. Stay with me. Level 26. Dolly's Smile. In the 1979 James Bond film Moonraker, there's a scene where Jaws, the hulking henchman with metal teeth played by Richard Kiel, meets a young blonde woman named Dolly in the wreckage of a cable car, and despite being a ruthless killer, he falls instantly in love with her, and she smiles back at him with a mouth full of braces. The metal-on-metal connection creating the entire joke of the scene. The visual gag that explains why these two misfits recognize something in each other. Why the romance works. Why audiences remember this as one of the more touching moments in a typically cynical franchise. Except when you watch the scene now, Dolly has perfect teeth. No braces. No metal. Just a normal smile. And without the braces, the entire emotional logic collapses. Why does Jaws suddenly become smitten with this random woman? What's the connection? What's the joke? The conventional explanation involves confabulation. Viewers, seeing Jaws with metal teeth meet a petite blonde and fall in love, might have unconsciously added braces to her smile to make the scene make sense. But this struggles with specificity. People don't vaguely recall some dental connection. They remember braces distinctly, can describe them in detail, sometimes remembering the camera focusing on her smile to reveal the braces as the reason for Jaws' change of heart. And here's what makes this one of the more unsettling Mandela effects. The scene doesn't work without the braces. The romance feels random, unmotivated, cinematically confusing in a way that professional filmmakers wouldn't typically allow, which makes you wonder whether something that coherent, that thematically perfect, that clearly intentional in thousands of people's memories could really just be mass confabulation, or whether the version they remember, the one where the scene actually makes sense, might be the version that was filmed, and what we're watching now is somehow different. Edited, altered in ways that leave the emotional beats intact but remove the visual details that explained them, creating a strange disconnect between narrative intention and what's on screen. Level 27. The Peanut Butter Ghost. Jiffy. Peanut butter is a product that doesn't exist and has never existed in any form at any point in American commercial history. A complete phantom brand that thousands of people nonetheless remember buying, eating, seeing in grocery store aisles, storing in their pantries alongside actual products like Skippy and Jif. And the false memory is so widespread that people describe the label, recall the taste, remember preferring it to other brands, can tell you which sandwiches they made with it as children. What actually exists is Jif, introduced in 1958, and Skippy, introduced in 1933. Two separate real peanut butter brands with similar-sounding names, and the conventional explanation suggests that Jiffy represents a blending of these two brands in memory. But this explanation doesn't account for the specificity. People don't vaguely recall some peanut butter. They remember Jiffy as a distinct brand separate from Jif and Skippy, often recalling all three existing simultaneously, comparing them, treating Jiffy as its own product. What's particularly interesting is that Jiffy exists in other categories. Jiffy Pop Popcorn, Jiffy Corn Muffin Mix, creating a name that's commercially familiar, but that doesn't explain why the false memory is so consistent across thousands who independently remember the same non-existent product. The psychological mechanism might involve the Jiffy baking mix, creating a brand association that gets misapplied to peanut butter in memory. Or it might involve the phonetic similarity between Jif and Jiffy, leading people to unconsciously extend the name. Or it might be simple confusion between two actual brands that somehow produces a third phantom brand in collective memory. But none of these explanations feel entirely adequate to account for the confidence with which people remember Jiffy peanut butter. The way they describe it not as something they vaguely misremembered, but as something they definitely bought, definitely ate, definitely saw on shelves. A product so real in memory that being told it never existed feels like gaslighting. Like being informed that a chunk of your childhood, the peanut butter brand your mom bought, the sandwiches you ate for years, was imaginary, fabricated, never actually experienced despite the clarity with which you can recall it. Level 28. Hello? Silence. In The Silence of the Lambs, the 1991 thriller that became one of cinema's most influential psychological horror films, there's a moment when FBI trainee Clarice Starling first meets Dr. Hannibal Lecter in his cell, and he greets her with a line that's been quoted and parodied thousands of times. "Hello, Clarice," spoken in Anthony Hopkins' measured voice, the two words establishing the unsettling intimacy that defines their relationship. Except Hannibal Lecter never says, "Hello, Clarice." Not in that scene, not anywhere in the film. The actual line is, "Good evening, Clarice," which has the same function, the same intimacy, but different words. And yet, "Hello, Clarice" has become the culturally dominant version, the line everyone quotes. The psychological explanation involves cultural transmission and quotation drift. Hello is a more universal greeting than good evening, works in more contexts, requires less temporal specificity. So, when people retold the scene or created parodies, they naturally shifted to the more flexible greeting. And that shifted version spread through culture faster than the actual line, becoming the canonical quote through sheer repetition. But this doesn't explain why the false memory feels so specific, so certain, so clearly attached to the actual scene rather than to parodies or references. People who've watched the film multiple times insist they remember hearing Hopkins say, "Hello, Clarice," can picture the moment, can hear it in their heads, swear they've watched that scene and heard those words, not as something they learned from a parody, but as something they experienced in the original film. And what makes this particularly unsettling is the pattern. This is the third iconic movie quote on this list that people misremember in exactly the same wrong way. Luke, I am your father. Mirror, mirror on the wall. And now, hello, Clarice. 3 lines from 3 different films spanning different decades, all misquoted by millions of people in identical fashion. All cases where the culturally dominant version doesn't match what was actually said, as if there's something about memorable quotes that makes them unstable in collective memory, susceptible to replacement by versions that sound more right even when they're demonstrably wrong. Level 29. New Zealand's Journey. New Zealand, the island nation in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, appears on maps in a location that thousands of people insist is wrong. Not slightly wrong, but fundamentally, impossibly wrong in ways that violate their clear memory of where this country was supposed to be. Current maps show New Zealand southeast of Australia, sitting in the Pacific Ocean east of the Australian continent, a position verifiable in every atlas, every geography textbook, every satellite image. But a significant number of people remember New Zealand being northeast of Australia, positioned between Australia and various Pacific islands in a location that current geography says has always been open ocean. This isn't vague spatial confusion. People describe specific memories of looking at maps in school, seeing New Zealand clearly positioned in a different location, and they describe the current position as jarring, impossible to reconcile with the mental map they've carried for decades. The conventional explanation involves map projection distortions and spatial memory errors. World maps compress three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional surfaces in ways that distort size and position, particularly for locations far from the equator, and the brain's spatial memory might store simplified, schematic versions of geographic relationships rather than precise positions, leading to false memories when the schematic version conflicts with actual placement. But this explanation struggles to account for the consistency of the error. If it were simple spatial confusion, you'd expect random variation in where people misremember New Zealand being. But instead, a large number of people remember the same wrong location, northeast rather than southeast, positioned in waters that maps say have always been empty. And there's something deeply unsettling about geographic Mandela effects specifically, because unlike brand names or movie quotes, geographic positions are supposedly objective, stable, verifiable through centuries of cartography and navigation, not subject to the vagaries of memory or cultural transmission. And yet, here are thousands of people insisting that an entire nation has moved, that the map they learned in childhood showed different continental relationships than the map they're looking at now. That reality has somehow shifted in ways that leave physical evidence. All the old maps, all the historical records, mysteriously updated to match a geography they don't remember existing. Level 30. The Wandering Heart. The human heart, the muscular organ that pumps blood through your cardiovascular system, sits in your chest at a position that anatomy textbooks and medical professionals all agree on. Slightly left of center, positioned behind and slightly to the left of the sternum, occupying space primarily in the left side of the chest with a small portion extending across the midline. But a significant number of people, including some with medical training, remember the heart being positioned much further to the left, almost entirely in the left chest, the kind of placement that would put it directly under the left breast, the position where you'd place your hand for the Pledge of Allegiance. This false memory is so persistent that when people see anatomical diagrams showing the heart's actual, more central position, their first reaction is often that the diagram is wrong, that surely everyone knows the heart is on the left side, not slightly left of center. The conventional explanation involves simplified teaching and cultural reinforcement. We say the heart is on the left. We teach children to place their hand over their left chest during the pledge. We describe chest pain on the left side as potentially cardiac, and this linguistic and behavioral pattern creates a schematic memory of heart equals left that gets spatially exaggerated into heart equals far left, rather than the more accurate heart equals center left. The actual anatomy hasn't changed. Historical anatomical texts show the same central left position. Medical procedures have always targeted the same location. The heart's position relative to other organs has been consistent across all human populations throughout recorded history. But the memory many people carry is of a heart that's positioned differently, more laterally, more fully contained in the left chest cavity. And what makes this unsettling is the physicality of it. This isn't about words or images or cultural artifacts that could be misremembered or misreported. This is about the arrangement of organs inside your own body, the position of a part of yourself that's been there your entire life, pumping blood through the exact same anatomical configuration since before you were born. And yet the version many people remember doesn't match the version that medical science says has always been true, creating a strange disconnect between internal body maps and external anatomical reality. Level 31. Kidney Relocation. Your kidneys, the paired organs responsible for filtering blood and producing urine, sit in your body at a position that medical textbooks describe as retroperitoneal, positioned high in the back near the bottom of the rib cage, roughly at the level of your lowest ribs, far higher than most people instinctively point when asked where their kidneys are located. The standard teaching is that kidneys sit at approximately the T12L3 vertebral level, which translates to the upper lumbar region, well above the waist, protected partially by the lower ribs. But a significant number of people, including those who've experienced kidney stones or infections, remember kidneys being located much lower, down near the pelvis, in the lower back at waist level or below. This false memory is reinforced by how we describe kidney pain. We say lower back when we mean kidney issues. We gesture to the lumbar region when explaining kidney problems. We associate kidney position with the area where back pain typically manifests. And all of these linguistic and behavioral patterns suggest a mental model of kidneys that sit lower than their actual anatomical position. The conventional explanation involves simplified anatomy teaching and the association between kidney pain and lower back discomfort. Kidney issues can cause pain that radiates to the lower back even though the organs themselves are positioned higher. And over time, this association between kidney problems and lower back sensation creates a false memory of the organs being located where the pain is felt rather than where they actually sit. But anatomical positions haven't changed. Historical medical texts show the same high retroperitoneal placement. Surgical procedures have always accessed kidneys through the same high posterior approach. Kidney transplants are positioned in the same location they've always occupied. And yet the spatial memory many people carry places these organs several inches lower than where they've always been, creating a disconnect between remembered body maps and verifiable anatomical reality that feels fundamentally wrong in ways that brand spellings and movie quotes don't. Because this is about the arrangement of organs inside your own body, parts of yourself that have been in the same position since you were born. Level 32. Continental drift. South America, the fourth largest continent, appears on current maps in a position relative to North America that thousands of people insist is wrong. Not in subtle ways, but in fundamental alignment that violates the mental geography they've carried since childhood. Current maps show South America positioned significantly east of North America, with the continent's westernmost point roughly aligned with the eastern coast of the United States. So a straight line south from New York City would hit the Atlantic Ocean east of South America rather than the continent itself. This geographic relationship feels backwards to people who remember South America sitting more or less directly beneath North America, aligned along roughly the same longitude with perhaps a slight eastern shift, but nothing like the dramatic offset shown on current maps. This isn't vague geographic confusion. People describe specific memories of looking at maps in school, seeing the two continents in clear north-south alignment, understanding the Americas as a connected landmass running roughly straight from Arctic to Antarctic. The conventional explanation involves map projection distortions. The Mercator projection and other common map types distort shapes and positions, especially at different latitudes, and the mental map people carry might be based on simplified schematic representations that emphasized north-south connectivity over precise longitudinal relationships. But this explanation struggles with the consistency of the error. If it were just projection confusion, you'd expect random variation in how people misremember the relationship. But instead, there's remarkable agreement. People remember South America as more directly south of North America, more longitudinally aligned, less dramatically offset to the east than current maps show. And what makes this unsettling is the scale and permanence. Continents don't move on human timescales. Their positions relative to each other are stable across thousands of years. Their placement is verified by GPS, satellite imagery, centuries of navigation, and yet here are thousands of people insisting that the relative position of two major land masses has somehow changed, that the map they learned showed different continental relationships than the map they're looking at now, that geography itself has shifted in ways that leave all the old maps mysteriously updated to match a configuration they don't remember existing. Level 33. Australia's proximity. Australia, the world's largest island and smallest continent, sits in the southern hemisphere at a position relative to Antarctica and Asia that strikes many people as fundamentally wrong when they look at current maps. Current maps show Australia significantly closer to Antarctica than many people remember, positioned in the southern reaches of the Indian and Pacific Oceans in a way that makes it seem almost adjacent to the Antarctic continent, and simultaneously further from Asia than the mental geography many people carry, with a larger expanse of ocean separating Australia from Indonesia and Southeast Asia than they recall. People describe specific memories of Australia being more isolated, floating further north in the Pacific, with more distance from Antarctica and less distance from Asian land masses, a position that made it feel more tropical, more remote from polar regions, more connected to the Pacific Island networks than the current map position suggests. The conventional explanation involves Antarctic map bias. Most common world maps crop Antarctica or minimize its presence, focusing on the inhabited continents and creating mental geography where Australia seems more distant from Antarctic waters than it actually is. And when people see maps that include Antarctica in proper proportion, the proximity feels wrong because it doesn't match the Antarctica minimized maps they've internalized. But this doesn't fully account for the Asian distance component. People remember Australia being closer to Indonesia, closer to Papua New Guinea, more obviously part of a Pacific Asian geographic network, and the current maps showing greater water distances strike them as incorrect in ways that Antarctic cropping alone doesn't explain. And the false memory extends to cultural geography. People remember Australia being more clearly part of Oceania, more connected to Pacific Island systems, more distant from Antarctic southern waters, a geographic identity that the current position, far south, far from Asia, close to Antarctica, seems to contradict. What makes this particularly unsettling is that Australia's position affects so much else. Shipping routes, climate patterns, biodiversity, cultural connections, all of which depend on the continent's actual position and have been stable for millennia. And yet thousands of people remember a different configuration, a different set of oceanic relationships. a different place for this massive landmass in the Pacific Indian Ocean system. Level 34. The Baseball Prophecy, Field of Dreams, the 1989 film about an Iowa farmer who builds a baseball diamond in his cornfield after hearing a mysterious voice, contains one of cinema's most quoted lines, the whispered instruction that drives the entire plot and became a cultural touchstone for faith, vision, and the power of believing in impossible things. If you build it, they will come. The promise that constructing the field will bring the ghosts of baseball legends to play there. Except that's not what the voice says. The actual line in the film is, "If you build it, he will come." Singular, referring specifically to the farmer's deceased father rather than to baseball players generally. A grammatical specificity that changes the prophecy from a general statement about attracting crowds to a personal promise about familial reconciliation. The cultural memory version, "They will come," transforms the line into universal wisdom about faith and manifestation, applicable to any situation where building something might attract people, while the actual line, "He will come," is narratively specific, tied to the plot's emotional core about father-son relationships. The psychological explanation involves universalization. Memorable quotes tend to shift toward more broadly applicable versions as they spread through culture, losing specific context in favor of general wisdom. So, "they" replaces "he" because it makes the line useful in more situations, quotable in more contexts, philosophically expansive rather than narratively narrow. But this doesn't explain why people who've watched the film multiple times, who own it on DVD, who consider it a favorite, still remember "they" with absolute certainty, can hear Kevin Costner's voice saying "they will come" in their heads, swear they've watched that scene and heard that plural pronoun. What makes this particular Mandela effect interesting is the pattern it fits. This is the fourth major movie quote on this list that people misremember in the same wrong direction. Luke, mirror, mirror, hello, and now they. All cases where the culturally dominant misquote has completely overwritten the actual line in collective memory, as if there's something about iconic movie dialogue that makes it unstable, subject to replacement by versions that sound more right, more universal, more quotable than what was actually filmed. Level 35. The iconic scene. Risky Business, the 1983 film that launched Tom Cruise's career, contains a scene that became so culturally iconic it's been parodied hundreds of times. Cruise's character, home alone, sliding across the floor in socks, white shirt, and underwear, dancing to Bob Seger's old-time rock and roll in a moment of abandoned joy. And in every memory of that scene, in every parody, Tom Cruise is wearing sunglasses, the Ray-Bans becoming as much a part of the iconic image as the sock sliding and the white shirt. Except in the actual scene, Tom Cruise isn't wearing sunglasses. He slides into frame in the white shirt, socks, and underwear, no sunglasses, no shades, just his face fully visible as he lip-syncs and dances, and the sunglasses that feel so definitionally part of that moment, so obviously present in the mental image millions of people carry, simply aren't there in the film. The confusion likely stems from other scenes in the movie where Cruise does wear sunglasses, particularly promotional photos and posters that showed him in the Ray-Ban Wayfarers that became synonymous with his 1980s image. And the brain, assembling the memory of the iconic scene, imports the sunglasses from those other contexts because they fit the overall aesthetic, the rebellious cool guy energy, the cultural iconography of Tom Cruise in that era. But the false memory is so specific, so universal that when people watch the actual scene and see no sunglasses, their first reaction is often confusion. This doesn't look right. Something's missing. This must be a different version or an alternate cut, because the version in cultural memory, the version that's been referenced and parodied for 4 decades, definitely had sunglasses. And what's unsettling is that the sunglasses feel more correct than their absence, as if the scene without them is incomplete, missing an essential element that should obviously be there. And reality's version, the one actually filmed and released, feels like the error, the wrong version. The cut where someone forgot to include the sunglasses that the scene demands, that the character requires, that exist so clearly in millions of people's memories that their absence seems impossible. Level 36. The Unknown Fate. On June 5, 1989, during the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing, a lone man stood in front of a column of tanks, blocking their path in an act of defiance that became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. The image of Tank Man shows him standing calmly with shopping bags, facing down the lead tank, which stops rather than run him over. And the standoff lasts several minutes before he's pulled away by bystanders and disappears into the crowd. And here's where memory fractures. A significant number of people remember Tank Man being run over by the tanks, crushed in front of the cameras, killed in the act of protest. Others remember him surviving, being pulled to safety. Both groups describe their memories as clear, certain. The actual documented facts are ambiguous. Tank Man was not run over in the footage that was captured. The tank stopped, the standoff occurred, he was pulled away by people in civilian clothes who may have been concerned citizens or plainclothes police. And after that moment, his fate is unknown. The Chinese government has never confirmed his identity or what happened to him afterward. And despite extensive investigation by journalists and human rights organizations, Tank Man's ultimate fate remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. So, both memories, that he was killed and that he survived, exist in a state of historical uncertainty, neither confirmed nor denied by available evidence. What makes this a Mandela effect isn't that people misremember the documented facts, but that they remember documentation that doesn't exist. Footage of him being run over, news reports confirming his death, or alternatively, news reports confirming his survival and later life. The psychological explanation involves narrative completion. The brain, encountering an unresolved story, creates an ending that provides closure, and depending on the individual's understanding of the Chinese government's behavior, their expectation about how such stories end, they construct a memory of death or survival to complete the narrative arc that reality left hanging. But the specificity troubles this explanation. People don't vaguely recall some outcome. They remember specific news coverage, specific footage, specific confirmations that the historical record says never existed, creating memories of documented facts in a case where the actual facts remain deliberately obscured. Level 37. The Presidential Motorcade. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, was captured on film by Abraham Zapruder, creating one of the most analyzed pieces of footage in history. The Zapruder film shows the presidential motorcade, and a significant number of people who've seen this footage remember the presidential limousine containing 4 people: President Kennedy, First Lady Jackie Kennedy, Governor John Connally, and his wife Nellie Connally. This memory feels specific, certain, based on clear recollection of seeing the crowded car. But the actual limousine, as shown in the Zapruder film and all other photographic evidence from that day, contained 6 people total, not 4. The Kennedys and Connollys in the back, and 2 Secret Service agents in the front, driver William Greer and Agent Roy Kellerman. The confusion might stem from angles and attention. Most analysis of the Zapruder film focuses on the rear of the car where Kennedy and Connolly were seated, where the fatal shot struck, and the front seat agents receive less attention in discussions and documentaries, potentially creating a false memory where only the 4 people in back are present, with the front seat forgotten or minimized. But this doesn't account for people who specifically remember counting people, remember discussing the crowding in the car, remember the seating arrangement as part of understanding the assassination sequence. The psychological explanation involves attention and memory consolidation. We remember what we focus on, and if documentary analysis focuses on the 4 people in back, our memory might encode 4 people in the car as the total rather than 4 people in back, essentially cropping the front seat out of the mental image. What makes this unsettling is the specificity and the stakes. The JFK assassination is one of the most documented, most analyzed, most discussed events in modern history, with the evidence preserved and available. And yet basic facts like how many people were in the car diverge between documented reality and widespread memory, suggesting that even extensively studied historical events aren't immune to collective false memories about fundamental details. Rest point. Pause here. 37 Mandela effects. Dolly's missing braces. Countries moving on maps. Organs shifting inside your body. The ground beneath reality feeling less solid. This isn't about memory being fallible anymore. That explanation felt adequate for brand names, maybe movie quotes. But geography, anatomy, historical events with photographic evidence, the conventional explanations start to strain when thousands independently remember the same impossible thing. What comes next goes further. The effects ahead aren't just unsettling, they're existentially challenging. They make you wonder about the nature of reality itself. Stay with me. Level 38. The man who named it. Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid revolutionary who became the country's first black president, died on December 5, 2013, at his home in Johannesburg at age 95. A death that sparked global mourning and extensive media coverage. These are the documented facts, verifiable through news archives and official records. But thousands of people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. Remember seeing news coverage of his death behind bars. Remember the funeral. Remember the grief and the discussions about apartheid continuing without him. Remember this so clearly that when he was released from prison in 1990, when he became president in 1994, when he died in 2013, these events felt wrong, impossible, contradictory to a death they distinctly recalled happening decades earlier. This phenomenon is so widespread, so specific, so detailed in people's memories that it gave the entire concept its name. The Mandela effect, coined by paranormal researcher Fiona Broom after she discovered that many people shared her false memory of Mandela dying in prison. The conventional psychological explanation involves confusion with other anti-apartheid activists who did die in prison, like Steve Biko, whose 1977 death became internationally significant, or the general expectation that activists imprisoned by brutal regimes often die behind bars, creating a false memory that combined Mandela's long imprisonment with the expected outcome of such imprisonment. But this doesn't account for the specificity. People don't vaguely recall he might have died in prison. They remember specific news broadcasts, specific dates in the mid-1980s, specific details about his prison death and funeral, memories with the clarity and confidence of actual events rather than confused expectations. And here's what makes this the central Mandela effect. It's self-referential, the phenomenon named after itself. The false memory so widespread and specific that it became the template for recognizing all the other cases of mass misremembering. And yet the very existence of the name implies that this isn't just memory failure. It's something strange enough, significant enough, patterned enough to require its own terminology, its own framework for understanding how thousands of people can remember the same historical event that never happened. Level 39. The Thinker's Pose. The Thinker, Auguste Rodin's bronze sculpture created in 1904, depicts a nude male figure seated on a rock in deep contemplation, one of the most recognizable works of art in the world. And if you picture the Thinker right now, you're almost certainly seeing a man with his chin resting on his hand, the fingers curled against the face, the classic contemplative pose. But look at actual photographs of the Thinker, and you'll see something different. The figure's hand is positioned on his forehead, the knuckles pressed against the brow above the eyes. Not the chin resting on the hand, but the fist pressed to the forehead. The false memory of chin on hand is so universal that when people see the actual forehead position, their first reaction is often that this must be a different sculpture, a variant, a copy that got the details wrong, because the version in their memory, the one they've carried for years, the one they'd swear they've seen in museums or photographs, definitely showed chin on hand. The pose that makes more intuitive sense for contemplation, that matches how people actually sit when thinking. The conventional explanation involves associative memory and cultural iconography. The chin resting on hand pose is common in other art and photography representing thought, appears in countless portraits and images, represents the cultural shorthand for contemplation. So, when we encounter the Thinker, our brains might substitute the expected contemplative pose for the actual one, storing the more familiar version rather than the specific pose Rodin created. But this doesn't account for people who've stood in front of the actual sculpture, who've studied it closely, who work in art history or museums, who describe specific memories of seeing the chin-on-hand version in person, sometimes even remembering guides or placards discussing the symbolism of that particular hand position. And what makes this particularly disorienting is that it's verifiable art. The sculpture exists, can be visited, can be photographed, hasn't changed in over a century. And yet the version in collective memory diverges from the version that physically exists in museums around the world, as if there's a gap between what people observed and what was there to be observed. Level 40. The Peaceful Kingdom. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, verse 6, in one of the Bible's most famous prophecies about the Messianic age, there's a description of the peaceful kingdom where predator and prey coexist harmoniously. And the verse is commonly quoted as, "The lion shall lie down with the lamb." A beautiful image of natural enemies at peace. This phrase appears in sermons, religious art, literature, everyday conversation, so culturally embedded that most people don't question its biblical source. But the actual verse in Isaiah 11:6, in every major translation going back centuries, doesn't mention a lion and lamb together. It says, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb," putting a different predator in the prophecy. The lion does appear in Isaiah 11:6, but with a different animal, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, making the lion-lamb pairing a combination that doesn't exist in the actual biblical text. The conventional explanation involves conflation. The lamb appears elsewhere in biblical prophecy and symbolism, particularly as a representation of Christ. And the lion also has strong biblical symbolism as representing strength, and, in some contexts, Christ as well. So the brain might combine these powerful religious symbols into a single memorable image, even though they don't appear together in this specific verse. The phrase lion and lamb has better cultural resonance. Stronger symbolic power represents a more dramatic reversal, the mighty lying with the meek, than wolf and lamb does. So it's the version that spread through culture, even though it's not the version in the text. But this explanation struggles against the fact that this is supposedly scripture, text that religious communities study carefully, memorize, quote precisely, treat as the literal word of God. And yet one of the most famous prophetic verses is consistently misquoted in exactly the same wrong way by millions of believers who'd swear they learned it correctly from the Bible itself. What makes this particularly significant is that religious texts are supposed to be stable, preserved, carefully maintained across generations, checked against original sources. And yet, here's a case where the culturally dominant version, the one in memory, the one in art, the one people quote as scripture, doesn't match what's actually written in any Bible you can open and read, as if collective memory has authority over written text, as if what everyone believes the Bible says matters more than what the Bible actually says. Level 41. The Prize Patrol. Ed McMahon, the television personality best known as Johnny Carson's sidekick on The Tonight Show for 30 years, became a familiar face in American households, and a significant part of his cultural identity involved showing up at people's doors with oversized checks, delivering life-changing prize money to surprised winners. Thousands of people remember Ed McMahon working for Publishers Clearinghouse, remember him as the face of those famous Prize Patrol commercials, remember the entire cultural phenomenon of Ed McMahon and Publishers Clearinghouse being synonymous. But Ed McMahon never worked for Publishers Clearinghouse. He worked for a competing company called American Family Publishers, which had similar sweepstakes promotions, but was an entirely separate business that eventually went bankrupt in 1998. Publishers Clearinghouse had its own prize patrol with different spokespeople, and while the two companies' marketing strategies were similar enough to be confusing, they were distinct entities, and Ed McMahon's association was exclusively with AFP, never with Publishers Clearinghouse. The conventional explanation involves brand confusion and the blending of similar marketing campaigns in memory. Both companies ran sweepstakes. Both used surprise prize deliveries as promotional hooks. Both became cultural touchstones in the same era. And the brain, storing the concept, celebrity showing up with big checks, might have consolidated the two companies into one memory with Ed McMahon, as the face of the more famous brand, rather than the one he actually represented. But this doesn't account for the specificity. People don't vaguely recall, he worked for some sweepstakes company. They specifically remember Publishers Clearinghouse, can describe seeing the company name alongside his image. Remember the marketing materials. Remember the connection as definitional to his public persona. And what makes this particularly striking is that it's a verifiable career fact. Employment records, contracts, commercial footage, all documentation shows McMahon working exclusively for AFP, never PCH. And yet the false memory is so pervasive that even after correction, even after seeing the documentation, people's first instinct is that the records must be wrong, that history has been revised, that somehow their clear memory of Ed McMahon and Publishers Clearinghouse is more real than the documented evidence of his actual employment. Level 42. The Evangelist's Death. Billy Graham, the influential evangelical Christian preacher who became one of the most recognized religious figures of the 20th century, died on February 21st, 2018, at his home in North Carolina at age 99. These are the documented facts, verifiable through obituaries and news coverage. But a significant number of people remember Billy Graham dying years earlier. Not in 2018, but sometime in the 2000s or even the 1990s. Remember seeing news coverage of his death. Remember discussions about the end of an era in American evangelicalism. Remember it so clearly that when he appeared in public events in the 2000s and 10s, these appearances felt wrong, impossible, contradictory to a death they distinctly recalled happening much earlier. This false memory is particularly strange because it's not a one-time confusion, but a recurring pattern. People report remembering Billy Graham dying multiple times at different points across several decades, as if his death kept happening and then unhappening, as if reality reset and brought him back only for memory to record another death that the timeline says didn't occur. The conventional explanation involves confusion with other prominent religious figures who did die during the periods people remember Graham dying, or general expectations about mortality at advanced ages, creating false memories of deaths that seemed overdue but hadn't actually happened yet. But this doesn't account for the recurring nature of the false memories, or the specificity with which people remember the news coverage, the funeral services, the retrospectives on his life and ministry. Details that suggest not vague confusion, but specific encoding of events that, according to the historical record, simply didn't happen when people remember them happening. And what makes this a particularly unsettling Mandela effect is the temporal repetition. It's not just one false memory of death at one wrong time. It's multiple false memories across multiple time periods, as if different groups of people remember Graham dying at different points, all of them wrong, all of them certain, all describing the same kind of detailed memory of an event that official records say only happened once, in 2018, not in any of the earlier years that thousands of people would swear they witnessed his death. Level 43. The saint's timing. Mother Teresa, the Catholic nun who spent decades serving the poor in Calcutta and became globally recognized for her humanitarian work, died on September 5, 1997, in Calcutta at age 87, and was canonized as Saint Teresa of Calcutta by Pope Francis on September 4, 2016, 19 years after her death. These are the documented facts, following the Church's normal timeline for canonization. But a significant number of people, including Catholics who follow papal announcements and canonizations closely, remember Mother Teresa already being officially recognized as a saint much earlier. Remember referring to her as Saint Teresa, or Saint Mother Teresa during her lifetime or shortly after her death in 1997. Remember the canonization happening much sooner than 2016. Sometimes remember it happening while she was still alive, treating the 2016 canonization as redundant, a formalization of a status she'd already held for years in their memory. The conventional explanation involves the popular use of saint as an honorific. Mother Teresa was so widely revered, so universally regarded as saintly in the colloquial sense, that people may have assumed or misremembered her having official sainthood, conflating her popular saint-like status with actual Catholic canonization, and the 2016 ceremony felt like it was catching up to what everyone already knew, rather than establishing a new designation. But this doesn't account for people who specifically remember the earlier canonization ceremony, who remember papal announcements, who remember the date being discussed in Catholic communities, who describe memories not of colloquial usage, but of official church recognition that they are certain happened much earlier than 2016. And what makes this particularly interesting is the pattern it fits. Like Billy Graham's death, like Nelson Mandela's prison death, this is another case where a major event in a globally recognized religious figure's life is remembered as happening at the wrong time. Not just by random individuals, but by large groups who share the same temporally displaced memory, as if the timeline itself is unstable, as if these significant moments occurred in one version of history that thousands of people remember, but that the documented record says never existed in the sequence they recall. Level 44. The Royal Feast. There's a famous portrait of King Henry VIII of England, the Tudor monarch known for his 6 marriages and his break with the Catholic Church, showing him in royal regalia, standing with his legs apart in a dominant pose and holding a turkey leg in his hand, the image of Renaissance excess that became iconic in representing both the king specifically and Tudor-era feasting generally. This image is so embedded in cultural consciousness that it appears in history, textbooks, historical documentaries, Renaissance fair promotions, and Halloween costume designs, the turkey leg becoming as much a part of Henry VIII's visual identity as his broad frame and ornate clothing. Except that portrait doesn't exist. There is no historical painting, no contemporary artwork, no period illustration of Henry VIII holding a turkey leg. The famous Hans Holbein portrait of Henry VIII shows him in elaborate dress with his hands prominently displayed, but holding no food. Other period portraits show similar poses, similar regalia, but no turkey legs, no food items, no feast imagery in the formal royal portraits that were meant to project power and authority, not dining habits. The false memory likely stems from later cultural representations. Movies, television shows, cartoon parodies, and Renaissance festival imagery all frequently depict Henry VIII with a turkey leg, creating a visual association that's so strong and so repeated that it feels like it must have originated in historical artwork rather than modern cultural interpretation. But the specificity of the false memory is striking. People don't vaguely recall some painting of him eating. They remember a specific portrait, can describe the pose, the clothing, the way he's holding the turkey leg. Sometimes even remember seeing it in museums or art history books. Memories detailed enough to feel like actual encounters with artwork that art historians confirm has never existed. And what makes this particularly significant is that it represents a false memory not just of recent commercial culture, but of historical art, creating a phantom artifact that thousands of people believe they've seen in the historical record. A painting that doesn't exist, but that feels more real in collective memory than the actual portraits that do exist and don't match what people remember. Level 45. The Enigmatic Smile. The Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci's portrait painted in the early 16th century, hangs in the Louvre Museum in Paris, viewed by millions annually, making it arguably the most famous painting in existence. And one of its most discussed features is the subject's smile. Subtle, enigmatic, the source of endless interpretation about what emotion it conveys. The conventional description emphasizes its subtlety, its ambiguity, the way it seems to change depending on viewing angle, the mystery of whether she's smiling at all or simply holding a neutral expression. But a significant number of people, including those who've visited the Louvre multiple times, who've studied the painting closely, who work in art or art history, remember the smile being more pronounced than it appears in the painting today. more clearly a smile rather than an ambiguous expression, more obvious in its emotional content, the kind of smile that wouldn't require centuries of debate about whether it's really there or what it means. When these people see the current painting, whether in person or in reproductions, the smile strikes them as fainter than they remember, more subtle, more ambiguous, as if the expression has somehow become less clear, less defined, more mysterious than the version they recall seeing. The conventional explanation involves memory exaggeration and expectation. Because the Mona Lisa's smile is so famous, so discussed, so central to the painting's cultural significance, our brains might enhance it in memory, making it more prominent, more obvious, more smile-like than the actual subtle expression Da Vinci painted. And when we encounter the real painting, the disappointment or surprise at how subtle it actually is creates a sense that something has changed. But this doesn't account for the consistency of the false memory. Many people don't just remember a more obvious smile, they remember specific details about the degree of upturn at the corners of the mouth, the visibility of contentment in the expression, details that they'd swear matched what they saw in previous viewings, but that don't match the painting as it exists today, hanging in the same museum, in the same condition, with the same subtle expression it's had for over 500 years. Level 46. The Casablanca line. Casablanca, the 1942 romantic drama starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, gave cinema one of its most quoted lines, a moment when Rick Blaine asks Sam the piano player to perform As Time Goes By. And the line everyone quotes is, "Play it again, Sam." Direct, simple, the three words that became shorthand for the entire film, for nostalgia, for trying to recapture what's lost. This line appears in film compilations, in references, in parodies, used as the title of a Woody Allen film, so culturally embedded that questioning its accuracy feels absurd. But Bogart never says, "Play it again, Sam." The closest the film comes is when Ilsa says, "Play it, Sam," and later Rick says, "You played it for her, you can play it for me," and "If she can stand it, I can. Play it." None of these are the famous line. None include again. None are the three-word command that lives in cultural memory. The false memory likely stems from compression. The scene involves multiple requests for the song, and the brain, storing the essence rather than the exact dialogue, creates a simplified version that captures the meaning, asking Sam to replay the song in the most efficient phrase possible, and "Play it again, Sam" does that better than the actual fragmented dialogue. But this is the fifth major movie quote on this list that millions of people misremember, and the pattern is striking. Luke, I am your father. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Hello, Clarice. If you build it, they will come. And now, play it again, Sam. 5 iconic lines from 5 different films spanning different decades, all misquoted by enormous numbers of people in exactly the same wrong way. All cases where the culturally dominant version has completely replaced what was actually said. And this pattern suggests something about how memory handles famous quotes. They become unstable, subject to optimization, refined through cultural transmission until the version that spreads isn't the version that was spoken, but the version that should have been spoken. The version that's more quotable, more memorable, more perfectly fitted to represent the moment than the actual words the screenwriter wrote. Level 47. The Prayer, Variance, the Lord's Prayer. One of Christianity's most fundamental texts, taught to children, recited in churches, memorized by billions across 2,000 years, exists in slightly different versions across denominations. but within any specific tradition the wording should be stable, consistent, and yet significant numbers remember the prayer differently than it appears in their denomination's current liturgy, particularly the line about forgiveness. Some remember, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us," while others remember, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors," and both groups are certain their version is the one they learned in childhood. The documented reality is that different translations use different words. The Catholic Church traditionally used trespasses in English, while some Protestant denominations used debts. But the confusion goes deeper than denominational differences, with people remembering their specific church tradition using different words than that tradition actually uses now, remembering learning one version as children and finding their church now recites a different version, as if the prayer itself has changed within their own denomination's practice. The conventional explanation involves exposure to multiple versions. If you grew up Catholic but attended Protestant weddings or funerals, or vice versa, you might have heard both versions and consolidated them in memory, storing whichever felt more natural or resonant, rather than the specific version your tradition used. But this doesn't account for people who describe isolated religious upbringings, who attended only one denomination, who were never exposed to alternative wordings, and yet remember a version that their lifelong church says it has never used. And what makes this particularly significant is that this is prayer, text that believers recite regularly, sometimes daily, text that's supposed to be stable and sacred, and yet memory diverges from current practice in ways that can't easily be explained by translation differences or denominational variations, as if even the most carefully preserved, most frequently repeated religious texts aren't immune to the phenomenon of collective memory diverging from documented reality. Level 48. The Star Trek Command. Star Trek, the science fiction franchise that began in 1966, gave popular culture countless catchphrases, but perhaps none more famous than Captain Kirk's transporter command. "Beam me up, Scotty," the 4 words that became synonymous with Star Trek itself, appearing on merchandise, in parodies, in everyday conversation. The phrase is so culturally embedded that it's become the go-to Star Trek reference, the line everyone knows even if they've never watched an episode. But Kirk never says, "Beam me up, Scotty." Not in the original series, not in the films. He says variations. "Beam us up." "Scotty, beam me up." "To beam up." But never the exact 4-word phrase that everyone quotes. The false memory stems from compression and optimization. The show featured hundreds of transporter commands across different episodes, and the brain, storing the pattern rather than specific instances, creates a canonical version that combines the common elements. Kirk, beaming, Scotty, into the most efficient phrase. And that optimized version becomes the memory everyone shares, even though it's a composite that never existed as spoken dialogue. This is the 6th major quote on this list that people misremember, and the pattern is now undeniable. Famous lines from famous media undergo a kind of evolutionary process, where the version that survives in cultural memory isn't the version that was said, but the version that's most fit for transmission, most quotable, most perfectly distilled. And that optimized version can completely replace the actual dialogue in collective consciousness. And this raises a question about the relationship between memory and reality. If millions of people remember the same optimized version of a quote, if that version is more widely known than the actual line, if it's the version that appears in references and parodies and cultural discourse, then in what sense is the real version, the one actually spoken in the original, more true than the false version that exists in collective memory. Which version is more real? The one that was said once on film, or the one that lives in millions of minds? Level 49. The Accumulation. And now, notice something about the Mandela effects you've heard. Several of them involved the same subjects appearing multiple times. The thinker statue. Is it hand on chin or fist on forehead? The Mona Lisa. Is the smile more or less pronounced than you remember? These aren't isolated Mandela effects, but subjects where people report multiple aspects changing, where the false memories accumulate around the same artifacts. Some people report the thinker changing positions multiple times in their awareness, the Mona Lisa's expression shifting across viewings. Logos they've seen hundreds of times appearing different on different occasions, as if these objects are unstable, flickering between versions, or as if our relationship to them is less fixed than we assume. The conventional explanation treats each Mandela effect as independent. You misremember the thinker's hand position for psychological reasons. You misremember the Mona Lisa's smile for different psychological reasons, and the fact that they're both famous artworks is coincidence. But the accumulation suggests something else, that certain subjects attract Mandela effects, that some objects or facts or quotes are more susceptible to this phenomenon than others, that there might be categories of information that are inherently unstable in collective memory. Famous artworks, iconic logos, movie quotes, biblical passages, geographic positions. These aren't random targets. They're categories of culturally significant, widely observed, supposedly stable information that nonetheless shows systematic divergence between collective memory and documented reality. And the subjects that accumulate multiple Mandela effects are often the most observed, most reproduced, most theoretically stable. The thinker exists in museums, photographed constantly, documented extensively, and yet people report its pose changing. The Mona Lisa hangs behind bulletproof glass, viewed by millions, studied by experts, and yet people report its expression shifting. These aren't obscure references or rarely seen artifacts. They're among the most viewed, most documented objects in human culture. And that's what makes the accumulation particularly unsettling. If the most observed, most stable, most carefully preserved artifacts can accumulate multiple false memories, then what does that suggest about the stability of consensus reality itself? Level 50. The mirror turns inward. You've heard 50 Mandela effects now. 50 examples of collective memory diverging from documented reality. 50 cases where what millions of people remember doesn't match what the evidence shows. And if you're still listening, if you've made it to this final level, then you're sitting with a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. What does it mean when memory and reality don't align? The conventional explanations: false memory formation, confabulation, pattern completion. They account for individual errors, for one person misremembering one thing. But they strain when applied to mass phenomena, when thousands independently generate the same false memory, when the errors aren't random but patterned, when the wrong version often makes more sense than the correct version, and they strain further when you notice what's being misremembered. Not obscure facts, but famous quotes, iconic images, basic geography, human anatomy, things people encounter repeatedly, things that should be stable in memory because they're stable in reality. The Mandela effect phenomenon points to something strange about the relationship between consciousness and reality, suggests that the world we're observing might not be quite as fixed as we assume, or that our observation of it is less reliable than we'd like to believe. You can choose to dismiss this as curiosity, as evidence of how fallible memory is. Or you can sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of recognizing that 50 examples of widespread, specific, patterned false memories might suggest something stranger than simple cognitive error. The Mandela effect doesn't answer what's happening. It just points to the gap between what is and what we remember, and asks you to notice that the gap exists, that it's wider than it should be, that it appears where memory and reality should align but somehow don't. The mirror turns inward. If this many people can be this wrong about this many things, what else are we collectively misremembering about the world we think we're living in? 50 Mandela effects. 2 hours. A journey from "that's weird" to "what is reality?" You've heard childhood book titles that millions spell wrong, movie quotes that billions misquote, geography that seems to have shifted, anatomy that appears to have changed, historical events that thousands remember differently than they happened. Some explanations felt adequate, others strained. And maybe by now you're not sure what to trust, your memory or the evidence, your certainty or the documentation, the world you remember or the world that is. If you're drifting off now, that's fine. That's the point. Let these patterns settle into wherever thoughts go when consciousness fades. And if you're still awake, still thinking, still uncomfortable with the gap between memory and reality, subscribe. There's always another layer to explore, always another place where what we believe and what is don't quite align. The work of questioning consensus reality never ends, because reality keeps revealing itself to be less consensual than we assumed. Sleep well, or don't. Either way, the world you wake up to might not be exactly the one you remember falling asleep in. And maybe it never was.